we're first going to have Kevin Mack lead things off. He's a developer, designer, sort of a little bit of everything, architect, UI guy. He can introduce himself with the proper title, I'm sure. But he's going to go over kind of just an overview of responsive web design and kind of get things going.
And just another thing with Columbus Web Group, we're trying to make it be a very active group, so both on the meetup.com and we're hopefully maybe have a Facebook page and a website, but it's really about these meetups, coming here, meeting new people, and hopefully some of you will raise your hand and present a topic. So, my name is Kevin Mack, and I work at Resource, and I worked on Resource's first responsive web project, which was Little Black Dress, and that was over 2 years ago. And in my free time, I spend all of it pretty much looking at best practices and how to reuse code and designs for development. Currently, I work on our reuse and best practices for developers, and I'm also part of a group called RAD, which is a Facebook group, and I highly suggest that you join that group. It's some of the best conversations and one of the best groups on the web. Just go to Facebook and search RAD. And I think everyone from Resource participates there, and all of my friends across the whole country do. All right, so there's a lot to discuss, and my initial presentation was over an hour and a half, and I tried to cut it back as much as possible, and I got it around 30 minutes. So I'll try to keep it as clean and simple and go down the path of really defining what responsive web design is, some methodologies that I use and apply to designing and doing concepts for responsive web, and then following up on how to apply context to users, and it'll be done through a demo that covers both design and developers. So there's some things that we didn't cover in this presentation, and one of them that everyone always wants to talk about, especially because it's one of the hot topics right now, is retina images and responsive images. But that's going to be a future meetup that we do, and I'm sure some of you will probably have your own opinions and says and solutions for it. So, and again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I see Matt, Mark, and Perry have a question. I don't know. Yeah.
Just answer my question.
Yeah. Is there a Mark here, or was it also that? Oh, hey, Mark.
I just want to see if I can ask you a question.
Yeah. I thought about doing that, but I wanted to keep it really simple. So.
I did the same thing when I tried it.
Well. Okay.
I told you this would be abused.
Yeah. But I will be looking at that. So, oh yeah, okay.
Wi-Fi.
Oh, the Wi-Fi password? We actually didn't give it out. Do you guys have?
I guess someone.
We'll get it right up on device.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to start off with this definition, and I feel like every presentation always needs something from Wikipedia, or you need to bring up Wikipedia. So I think this is actually a pretty good definition, and it's very wordy and lengthy, and it just says a web design approach aimed at crafting sites to provide an optimal viewing experience, easy reading, and navigation with minimum of sizing, panning, and scrolling across a wide range of devices from mobile phones to desktop, computers, and monitors. So it is a mouthful, but it kind of covers everything that responsive web is. And as we go over the next couple slides, we'll talk about the devices and also some of the ways to apply and start off a responsive project. As some of you probably know, that responsive web came around 2007. There was this article that was actually published on May 25th of 2007 on listapart.com by Ethan Marcoux, where he coined the term responsive web design. And from there, it kind of blew up on the web, and everyone was like, well, what do I do? Can my site do this? And then as technology grew, it's now becoming more of a standard for approaching websites and designing for them. So to start is looking at the landscape of devices. And this is a graphic that I actually pulled from lukew.com, and he neatly summarizes our current device landscape in this one single image. So it goes from the smallest devices to the largest devices. And one piece that I like to talk about when dealing with responsive design, especially the designers, developers working together, is stop calling it the iPhone, the mobile phone, the tablet, the desktop experience. It's just the design. And you have the design that's the largest scale possible, and then you have the design that's the smallest scale possible. And you're not focusing on those individual devices, you're focusing on the content and the actual design itself. So this graphic is also really nice because it talks about kind of like the context of the user and when they're using this device. So the smaller devices like your phones are more in your hand, your laptop or tablet can kind of be in between, but it's primarily on your lap or on a desk. And the desktop, of course, you're not going to be carrying that around in your pocket. And with that, one of like the huge issues that I see with responsive web is people think once my screen size starts getting smaller, I relate it to my iPhone, my Android phone that has touch capabilities. But some Android phones don't even have touch capabilities. They're still using some kind of like cursor. There's Blackberries that people are still buying. And then there's also desktop computers that are now touch capable. And we'll probably see more and more of those functionalities out there. And the one thing that's not pictured in here is like your big screen plasma TV. And that's just because right now there aren't too many browsers that are supporting it, and the built-in browsers are more of my laptop and I'm using a secondary screen like this. So when starting with responsive web, really the first step is adding a meta tag, which is just the viewport meta tag. And it has two attributes, which is just name and content. And this is my basic setup for pretty much every responsive project that I do. And there's some options within the content of what you can put in there. So you can have width set to device width, and I'll show what the difference between device width and what width is equal to an actual number and how those actually look together. And then initial scale for a minimum and maximum. And what the maximum does is it actually disables that pinch functionality that we may be used to. So when you go to a website, maybe you want to see a graphic bigger, you kind of want to zoom in, so you pinch. By having that maximum scale in there, it disables that. And that's one of those big like no's, do not do for accessibility. And I'm a huge nut about accessibility. So that's one of my pet peeves is people that are using that. So this image on the left and right, they're both using the exact same code base. The only difference is the image on the left doesn't have that meta viewport in there. It has nothing. And the meta viewport just lives in the head of your HTML code. You apply it once and it goes across the site. So again, same code, the only difference is that meta tag is there. And an example of a site that actually uses the viewport set to that width number down here is apple.com. And there's debates whether or not apple.com is responsive and whether or not if just adding this on your website makes your site responsive. Because if you don't have this on your site at all, it actually scales the content out. Maybe you just see like a little chunk of it if you have it just defined to a width. And Apple actually defines it to a specific width, so when you load it up, it looks similar to like this left image. The next step is really starting to use media queries. And media queries live in your CSS, and they all start with @media. And there's multiple types when dealing with media queries, but for responsive, you focus on screen. And I first started using media queries when it was print. And for anyone that's been developing or designing for the past maybe 10 years, you started using the print.css. So I had my design, and when I printed it off, I had some random like straggling pages at the end. And it was like, well, how do I fix it? Well, I make a print.css, and then I use @media print. So that was really the first introduction to people in media queries that I'm really aware of. And with media queries with responsive, you do and then you set one of these features. And there's a handful of features that are available, but with responsive, it's best to just focus on your width and height and those max and minimum of them. Again, this lives in your CSS, and then you just add additional CSS inside of it. So here's just a basic CSS structure. It's not really anything to take in, but it's just a CSS file. And at the bottom of my code, I have two media queries, one that's set to 940 and one that's at 400. And how CSS works, it reads from the top to bottom. And having your media queries at the bottom, you're either overwriting the properties that you've already defined or adding additional properties. So you're either extending or overriding. There's no way to delete a property. You have to just figure out how I'm going to make that work. And a website can have more than one media query. It's actually a really good approach to have multiple ones on your website. And you'll also notice that it's at 940 and 400. Those are just kind of arbitrary numbers for this example, but I'm not targeting specific devices. I read an article that I think Adam Weis actually showed me about the performance of having too many media queries, and it doesn't really slow down your page. It's very fractional, and it's about the same speed as adding another selector in your site. So with media queries, it brings a discussion about like what's a breakpoint and how you define a breakpoint, whether it's fluid versus adaptive. And breakpoints, I just simply define it as when my media query happens. And maybe I start scaling my content or I move my content around. And fluid is that motion of moving from the largest screen to the smallest screen, or the smallest screen to the largest screen. And it's best shown in this simple example of I have a container. So imagine this is a web page, and this gray block is just a container on my website. And it's set to 1040. And I have a container inside there that's 370 and another one that's 670. So that's my layout. Imagine there was content inside it. So how I make this fluid and start that responsive process is I divide 370 by 1040 and then multiply it by 100. I do the same thing for 670, divided by 1040 and multiply it by 100, and then of course add a percentage at the end. So it's the child container divided by the parent container multiplied by 100. And so in this example, if this was actual code, you would see it scaling to the full width, and as I move my browser smaller, it's going to scale down. So then what if I had additional containers inside that 670? So I have 168 and I have 502. Well, I'm not going to divide 168 by that 1040. I'm going to divide it by its parent container, so it's 670. So I do 168 divided by 670. And I do the same thing for the 502 divided by 670. I've seen people try to make it way overcomplicated by doing some weird equation between the parent, the grandparent, and that child, and multiplying by that 64% that we got. But it's just looking at the parent width and dividing it out. So if I were actually to divide that 168 by 670, I would get 25% and 75. With this, it kind of leads into the adaptive conversation because, again, my max width of that image, of that little container down here, was 168. So my browser is 1040, and as I get smaller down, that 168 is going to be 25% of that parent container. So when 1040 width of my browser turns into maybe 600 pixels, that's going to be incredibly small. There's really no content that would ever exist there. So you have to then take more of an adaptive approach and start deciding how am I going to redesign this zone and move it above or below. And back to this slide is I've definitely seen people do this wrong, deciding when to use breaking points. I'm defining my breaking points before I even start the design or creative process. I know I've been guilty on those conversations, being like, well, this is a responsive website. How do we even charge a client or someone for this work? Well, it's based off the media queries. I have no idea how many media queries are going to be because I have no idea what the design is going to be. So it's something that you just do as you design throughout the website. And then also people decide to make weird breakpoints. Like all of a sudden I'm scaling down my browser and then it switches to like a flyout menu, but my navigation's still fitting in the window. Like it doesn't make sense. People are thinking of it more of those devices and not the actual design and content. So those are the three main pieces when it comes to like just starting off, like the basic bare bone principle of responsive web. And as I was saying, like I feel like we've been really doing this wrong and we're overcomplicating it and we're forgetting about the whole design, the user experience, and how someone's going to go to my website. We're either targeting those devices or making the design change randomly for no apparent reason. And one benefit of responsive web is that you have this one code base that's all handled with primarily CSS and HTML, and you, depending on what you're doing, using some JavaScript. But the heavy lifting is done through your CSS and those media queries. So it's supposed to be easier to update my site. But a lot of times you see a responsive site and it's just the worst code that you've ever seen, and you end up spending more time updating the code or updating the copy images than it would be if I had a M.dot, a touch dot, or a tablet dot experience, like having multiple sites. So approaching it and really planning ahead of time is going to prevent you from having those types of issues. And again, I'm a huge fan of context of users, and we kind of forget about that. Going back to like that touch, we're changing out maybe CTAs to be a swipe, but maybe swipe's not available for me. Or maybe I'm on my tablet and I'm expecting it to be swipe because I swipe everything else, but it's still a click. So it's looking at the individual pieces of the site and identifying them and trying to make it be the best for each experience. So my approach for this is really to start with a couple wireframes. So I do either 3 or 4 wireframes, and the wireframes base off the largest size and the small size of your content. And then there's a third one that's actually based off of those device capabilities. So you look at your design, you look at the actual zones that are inside there, and you start switching them out based off those device capabilities. So maybe if touch is available, it's not a checkbox, but maybe it's a swipe or something that I can drag with my hand. Just being aware of those types of things. This is an amazing quote by Benjamin Franklin. And it just says, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And when you approach any project, whether it's responsive or a web design, you need to prepare. And responsive sites definitely require more preparation. There's 2 methodologies that I like to think about or apply to projects. And it's BEM, that stands for Block Element Modifier, and Atomic Design. I like to use these 2 in combination, and BEM is a very complex topic, and I'm just going to describe it for naming conventions and show you this little demo of what BEM is. So this is a basic design website, and you can see a header section, a footer section, and a main content section. In BEM, those are all referred to as blocks. So you're identifying sections of your website and calling them blocks. And you're not just identifying them, you're giving them name like header, main, footer. In each of those sections, you can have additional sub-blocks. So like the header up here has a logo block, a navigation block, a search box, an authentication block. And the reason why this is important is for that naming convention. So from the start of the project, when you're planning out things, you actually sit down and you put out a naming convention for your project. So everyone knows from the beginning, whether you're working with your information architects, whoever's doing the wireframes, to the person that's testing your site, to the person that's developing and designing it. We all know that this is a header and it has these pieces inside of it. So blocks are just really a basic building block of your site. They're a zone or a content. And then blocks contain what are called elements, which are a piece that have a specific functionality. And then there's modifier, which is just variations of those. So maybe my button that has a specific functionality is red, so I modified it. So that's a quick overview of BEM. And the other methodology is atomic design. And you'll see some overlapping pieces of these 2. So atomic design is made up of these 5 pieces, which are atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, and pages. And atomic design, it was created by Brad Frost, who's one of my favorite people to follow online. And if you're not following him, definitely check him out because he's very, very smart. And this is probably my favorite thing that he came up with. So atoms are HTML elements. So you can see a label on the right-hand side, an input, and a button. And now we've applied some styling to these, so it looks more presentable and closer to what the UI is going to be. Atoms live inside molecules, so it starts defining them a little bit more. It puts the atoms in a place that makes sense. So you can see that these are the same atoms that are being put all together to make this little search box. And there can be variations of these, and you can use your atoms to create other molecules. molecules contain organisms. So this has a navigation, a search block, and probably a logo block. And then you can even take variations of these and keep building your site. And then what you do is you use your organisms to build out templates. So a template is just really these blocks of functionality of content that you know that you're going to have and putting them together. And this is going to be really important, and we'll hit on this in the demo, that building out these blocks and being flexible is going to lead to actual designs or pages. So templates then turn into pages. So you can see that this may be a home page, but it's just built off of everything that we talked about, from templates to organisms, molecules, and atoms. And as you move from atoms to pages, it becomes more concrete. So up here may be the brainstorming, us working out the pieces of what's going to be in the site, what's the look and feel, and the concepts. And then down there is the actual pages, and maybe the client handoff or the first show of the client or the final page. And with this, you're building out pieces that you're actually going to be using throughout your process and your project. So it's not throwaway. So one thing that's really kind of hard to understand and grasp is, because responsive is this living organism. It's not just your desktop. It's not just your mobile. It's not whatever. It's the full thing. And it's best shown probably through some kind of interactive template. And for that to happen, you still need to kind of show a comp or some kind of design to represent what you're going to be building out to the client. And there's not really a good answer to this because it's going to be different per client and per project that you're working on. But majority of the time, clients, and whether your client's your CMO, CIO, CEO, your best friend's mom, yourself, you need to start planning this out. And depending on what the situations are, they probably are used to seeing the desktop version first. Or maybe they're used to seeing the mobile version first. So you want to build it into whatever your client is requesting. And kind of build in those principles and building blocks as you're doing it and be thinking about it. And one of the big things that I like to say is, even though you're not showing them a Photoshop file, if you can show them a template, that's still designing. Like, code can be designed. And designing or developing code is designing. So that's, if they need to see a PNG or a Photoshop file, well, you can just take a screenshot and place it in there and send it off. So really, when it comes to responsive web, as I said, planning and collaboration is very, very important. An agile workflow works the best, but it's having your designers and your developers talking. And I like to say it's actually more than just designers and developers. It's the technology side of the project and the creative side of the project. Because maybe a copywriter is going to come and say, this title that you guys were designing to be 2 words is actually going to be 15 words. And if I didn't plan for that ahead of time, I could have coded in a way that isn't going to be fitting for 15 words. And also with the technology side, you can also bring in things like user detection and other pieces and brainstorming. So it's all about that tech creative communication. So here's an example. This is actually some work that Resource did, and this is for the PNG Global eStore. And this was an early comp of it, and it doesn't show the navigation, but to me it doesn't really even matter, because what we're going to do is focus on zones. And I'm going to start by focusing on the top and then dive into the middle section and then build out the middle section in code. So when I start a project, or we start working on a project, one of the best things to do is, it's at a width, and this was designed at 1024. So the discussion of what happens after 1024 for those bigger pixels needed to happen. So if I expand this out to 1200 pixels, you can see, well, does this blue repeat on the left and right? What are we doing about this parent image? Or does it all stop at 1024? What happens above that actual design? And these are the types of things that you get out of having like an active template. And then this is expanded out at 22 pixels. And for this site, we actually decided that the header section was going to span across the whole width, and then the other sections were actually stopped at 1024. After looking at the widths and those maximum, like what happens after my maximum design, it's to look at the images and highlighting them the way that they would be cut for production and actually development. So you can look at this and you can see that there's 3 main images, actually 4 main images, and we get used to seeing them with their transparency and what those actually look like on screen, not what they really are. And every image actually has a border around it because we're eventually going to cut it to be that way. So highlighting the background image first and then looking at other content around it. So now you can see that I kind of have this container. My images are turning into more than just an asset, but a restriction for my design. And then you can use these restrictions to design within at a later time. So one thing by doing that, you can see that at the bottom, there's some additional pixels that aren't even being shown. But by highlighting them, it makes me think about those bottom ones. Another thing is, the initial image was cut at 1024. So by highlighting what that 1024 is on the left and right, you can see that the image, that downy bottle on the right, actually goes outside of my maximum constraint. So I need to think about that when I'm coding. Another piece is that top is actually offset at the top. So by doing that, I can identify these pieces and have the full image at a later time. And the reason why I highlight the bottom is, well, because maybe later in this project as it moves down, I want to see the bottom of those bottles. And if I didn't cut it to show the bottom of the bottles, it may be weird if it's like floating in my backgrounds like a dark color and then I have this space of cut bottle space and then this container ends. Or if I didn't cut that right side, if I didn't leave in the right side of that downy bottle and then start scaling it down, well, that image is always going to have to stay on the right hand side. So by doing this, I have more flexibility for the overall design. The next thing is applying a grid, and it's based off of my default space on this project, which is 20 pixels. So this is after a designer has already kind of designed a first comp or some kind of look and feel of the design. And a developer sits next to a designer and starts highlighting these and circling those blocks and those sections and identifying how this can actually be developed. So I start with my maximum padding and margin, which is 20 pixels, and then I go into a smaller one, which is 10 pixels. By doing this, it allows me to identify those constraints and those pieces of the that are actually going to be code. So then I apply I do the vertical and then horizontal. One of my big pet peeves and one of the things that people do incorrect on responsive is they make their paddings and margins a percentage. And it's one of the strangest things to do because if you ask me to design a mobile website, I wouldn't have my gutter set to 7 pixels and some change or 12 pixels and then this one over here is another one. It's going to be consistent across the whole project. So that's why I like starting from there and looking at my actual padding and margin and then defining those pieces inside for the consistency and keeping my margins and paddings from scaling. So this is just that same image kind of pulled out. You can see that grid in the background. And why I like to put that grid is it doesn't have to be done in like Photoshop. Like this design can happen and then I can apply a grid and print it off and we can circle it. It's much quicker than trying to do it in Photoshop. But the one weird thing about Photoshop is you can't print with a grid. So a little trick that I do is I create a pattern based off my design, my default space, and then I just apply it on top of it and set it to a percentage. So then when I print it off, I can actually see what those widths are. It also helps with all the containers and things like this bottle being offset. And this is something that has really helped me identify those content zones and identifying like this is not just an image that's cut here. This is actually an image that goes all the way up here and goes all the way out here. One other thing is people always talk about starter kits or using grids, and this design was started using a grid. But by using a grid, there's kind of this issue of the look-alike syndrome, a potential ability to scale, sometimes bloat, or it's not going to do what you really want it to do. So I suggest starting with a grid and then kind of building out custom zones. And one thing I said was I'm focusing on this individual section or this individual block, and then I'm going to make this fully responsive. I'm not looking at the full site. I'm looking at each zone because they all have their own content, and responsive needs to be focusing on content and how it's going to be actually served. To me, it doesn't matter how that full page looks. It's how this zone looks, and it should look seamless throughout every experience. You're not going to break this to go underneath it when my navigation changes. Maybe that will happen, but in most cases, you should be targeting and looking at individual zones. So to start, I have this basic HTML layout. It's just, I'm not going to get into the code, but it's just showing the same copy that was there and all the zones that were kind of laid out and defined between that designer-developer interaction. I'm using Sass in this demo, and Sass is just one of the best things that ever happened to me as a front-end developer, especially for responsive web. It has some built-in pieces, like you can do nested media queries, and that percent that I was talking about earlier of child container divided by parent container multiplied by 100. Well, Sass has a percentage built into it, so all you need to do is input some variables. And it also allows you to use variables for your maximum width and some of those breakpoints in organizing your code. So here's my basic DOM structure, and it's just based off that content that was there, unstyled. Doesn't look like much because it's just the content. I'm using placeholder, and placeholder is one of my favorite things because it breaks away that actual what is the content and makes me focus on the restraints of that content. So you can go to placeholder and you can create an image. You can even change the color like I did here. So after you have that basic structure, of course you're going to need to apply some styling. And I'm just going to turn on my global stylings and some modular styling to align with the image itself. So you can see that this looks like that image. And this is actually pixel to pixel to what that image was. The only difference is how the text renders. So if you align these on top of each other, all the padding, margins, and spacing would align. As I scale down the browser, you can see that this image is just going to go off to the side and you start losing the content. In some cases, maybe that's what you want it to do. But in this case, the designer wanted it to actually scale down. So the first thing to do is to add in our first media query. And looking at that parent container that was set to 1024, I'm going to override it. And I'm going to be using variables from Sass in this example. And I'm going to use max width, and max width is 1024, and I keep those separate in another file. Which using variables are really helpful, especially as you're prototyping designs. And then I'm going to add in another variable that's called default space, which is just set to 20 from my design, and I'm going to multiply it by 2. And I use this setup a lot when doing responsive sites, and all it's going to do is say 1024 again, there's my maximum design. And as I scale down and get smaller, it's actually going to look at 1024 plus 40, which is 1080. So I have a consistent gutter all the way across the site. And then I can control that more later on. And then I make my width from 1024 to auto, so I override that property. You can see it starts scaling down. So this is an interesting thing because my background or my container is now scaling down, but my image is behind it. In some cases, this may be right, but this is where the designer says, well, you know, that was a product and it doesn't really look right. So we have to work that in. And the next step is the designer and the developer start tweaking this. So that building out the template and the initial frame was led by the developer. And this is where it's developer is developing, but the designer is sitting there and developing with them. So I set this image, again that image was 660, and I divided by my max width or parent container, which is 1024, and this image is going to start scaling down. So this is where the real conversation between the designer and developer really happened. So it scales down, and now this image is at this top, and it's just really, really weird, and this would never happen. You would never design a site like this, and if you went to a site where a product image was behind this title and it was floating up at the top, you would think it was broken. So the designer and developer start working on some other concepts. We're going to keep that image scaling down, but then at 917, instead of it staying at the top, I'm going to make it go to the bottom. And that image on the right-hand side was just absolutely positioned. So as you see, it will start scaling down. And in the bottom down here, this number that's happening, it's a Chrome plugin, and it just allows me to see the size of my browser. So at 917, the designer says this is where the content needs to change and start adapting it. So at 917, that image didn't have any hiccup at all. So as you saw me scale down, it kind of stayed there in its position with no real bump or move. And the reason why that happened was I used Chrome Developer Tools, and then I took that image at 917 and inspected it to get its actual width, which was 591. So as I'm scaling down, I know my browser is at 917, but then when I get there, I don't want that image to scale anymore. So I stop it from scaling, and I look at what the size of that image is in Chrome Developer Tools, and I save it out in my code. So that's where I got the 591. It wasn't some like crazy wizardry of math. And there are a lot of tools that are built into Chrome and additional plugins that you can use for helping to design. So you can see it there, and it looks fluid. Another one of my weird pet peeves is that jumping feel, and that's really an easy way to get over it. So the next step is, well, once that image starts scaling down, what about this copy up to the left-hand side? It looks weird. So the designer says, well, we want this to start expanding over this image now. So we go back to our code, and we work on some different variations of it. And we're now going to make that code, instead of it being that weird quarter size, to fill out the full width of it. So if you watch that copy there, as I scale down, that image is getting smaller, and then it stops getting smaller, and then it continues to start scaling down. And then the copy will lay on top of it, like that. The next step is, well, this is a product image, and it's something that's really important to this brand, this look and feel of this zone. So instead of keep scaling it down, I'm going to actually move it below. So as I go down smaller, I just bump it down there, and it becomes more of an adaptive approach. So throughout this whole process, every single pixel was almost designed, and this is done really, really quickly. It's just a developer and a designer sitting next to each other and trying different things out. So to show these two kind of on top of each other, I'm using the iOS simulator. So you can see the mobile version on the right and the desktop version behind it. And everything kind of looks like how it should. It looks like a design mobile site, and it looks like a design desktop site. And all the pieces are the same code base. So another thing you can do with that is you can start outlining all the pieces of your HTML. So this becomes more like an interactive wireframe or an interactive template. And it's based off those maximum constraints of those containers as I'm going from the smallest size to the largest size. And what you can actually do is take your code and these examples that we just developed of that zone and set it to the width that you want to design and show the client. So on the right is 768, which is the portrait view of the iPad, and the left is the mobile size. So now I can bring this, take a screenshot of this if we didn't want to continue designing it in code, and open up Photoshop and use this as my guides. And everyone knows about all the maximum and minimum constraints. So here's the same code, and all I did was change out the assets and the background colors, and now it looks like the actual design itself. So basing it off of those constraints and those containers, I'm able to create this experience from things that I could never imagine in Photoshop, but I can actually see and develop in code. So there's that image scaling down. And then you'll see it go below. And then here's the mobile on top of it. So again, this also becomes interactive, and I can see everything, and it looks like it was intentionally designed for every aspect of it. One of the things I like to say is that a good responsive site is a responsive site that you don't realize it. Last piece is we've been really focusing on the content and the design, the UI of this, but there's another piece of this which is going back to that third or fourth wireframe and looking at the context of the user and how that user actually interacts with your site. One of the things that we stopped doing was personalization and context of the user. At least that's what I started noticing out there, because we were focusing on how do we develop for all these growing devices out there. Everyone's on their mobile phone. We need to do that. We forgot about that personalization and where that user is. So as a reminder, I like this quote because I worked with on our mobile team at Resource, and a lot of times we got so involved with it being a mobile device and the mobile content and context of that device that we forgot about where that user is. So it just says mobile is a user state, not a device, meaning this experience needs to fit that user no matter what their device is, wherever they are, and whatever they're doing. And every experience should be focused around it. And at Resource, we created a term called Responsive Experience Design, or RxD. And this is actually going to be a future meetup about RxD and how you apply those contexts of user and how they interact in their specific location at their specific time on their specific device, and creating all these variations of the same design and kind of building on top of each other. And I see that, I don't know how to say this name.
Fade.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
So I was just going to say, what was that guy's name again that you like to follow on the internet?
Brad Frost.
Say that again?
Brad Frost.
Brad Frost. Okay, thanks.
Any questions?
What do you think about responsive typesetting? I've seen some articles people set their fonts to respond as well. You try that?
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. It depends on whatever the text is. It's better than having an image that has text and scaling it down, because you lose SEO, flexibility of changing it out. So instead of going into Photoshop and me opening it up and saving out a new asset, well, I can just open up my code and change a line and it'll scale down. There's nothing really wrong with it, but you shouldn't use it in its right place. Cool. All right. And Adam and Tim are going to do a couple reviews of some sites. And Adam, you guys met earlier. He introduced himself, but he's a senior developer at Resource and comes with a lot of experience with responsive web. and he's really helping grow this group, hopefully, by leading it. And Tim is an art director at Resource, and he has a lot of experience with doing responsive web from the design side. So,
My mustache cooped up my beard since sun.
so if you give me a second, I'll switch this over for you.
So what did the final tally end up being? So we got 14 developers and 16 designers. So almost half and half. Thought for sure we were going to have, yeah, but that's the total that actually voted.
Do you remember what the size was? Cool.
So as Kevin said, we're going to be reviewing some sites. These aren't sites that we've done internally. We thought that'd be a little weird. So we just thought we'd try to pick some sites that had some different aspects that we thought were important. On the web, a lot of times when there's discussion or case studies or stories around some sort of responsive site, a lot of times it's more of a portfolio site or one-page site, which is great and all good and whatnot, but there's a lot more of a challenge once you get to a much more robust site. So we try to focus more on that. So we're going to be showing two sites. We're going to be showing Polygon.com, which is kind of a video game review site. A lot of content, more of like a journalist approach. And we're also going to be looking at Microsoft.com, just because they're Microsoft, and it's interesting to see what they're latching onto and what pieces that they're going to be kind of pulling into their website and kind of some of the decisions they made. So that just a quick setup of what we're going to be showing and talking about. Let me quick pull up some other stuff.
Cool. So the first one we wanted to take a look at was Polygon, like Tim said. One of the interesting things is on large screens, when this site's loaded up on the homepage, the entire page weight is 2.7 megabytes. It's 119 requests, and 75 of those are images. And then on the small screen, it's actually a 1.3 megabyte page with 93 requests and 37 images. So they've definitely done some things to kind of trim down the overall page weight by reducing images and some unnecessary content, and done a good job of that.
Yeah, and depending on the site, all really depends on how much you want to optimize it from desktop to mobile. Being that this is a site that's probably being viewed on both quite a bit, that's definitely a big consideration they made. Starting right from the top, some of the interesting design decisions they made as well is a lot of times you find, especially with responsive, clients or whoever you're designing towards wants to have a lot of content above the fold. I mean, there's a lot of debate of whether there's really a fold or not. And typically the solution is a carousel. I thought it was interesting that Polygon did something a little different. They used this gridded approach, so they have a series of articles right up top. They can see right from the get-go some of their more content that they're really trying to raise up front. So it's a nice gridded approach, and as you see, once you start reducing, getting more to a mobile resolution, you're just broken down into what their most top-level stories that they're wanting to bring up. So as you're going from the desktop width down to the mobile width, you start reducing the number of pieces you're getting within the grid, and then those article kind of tiles or squares end up folding down below the section. So really interesting use of that top section, top zone. Another kind of cool thing they do in regards to design as well as how they implement it with development is the way that they're using photography and how the photos you're seeing here, how well they adapt to being pulled into different places within the site. So what they do that's really smart is the way that they crop their images, they try to keep whatever the main subject matter is kind of in the center, So as it's cropping down to different sizes, for the most part, it always crops in a pretty aesthetic way and keeping the subject matter right square center. For the most part, it works really well. There's always a couple instances where it breaks a little bit, but really cool use. And as well as like the way that they're using the gradients, what they're actually doing is pulling the photography over the top of the gradient and then putting opacity on the image itself, so you get that nice effect of it almost looking like there's a gradation over the top. So just, kind of a unique treatment there, and that's part of what gives the overall look and feel of polygons.com.
Yeah, as Tim said, the images on this are probably one of the most interesting things. And the approach that they took to kind of do the responsive image solution is something that they've kind of built themselves. Microsoft uses something called Picture Fill, but Polygon kind of built their own solution. And it's interesting for a few reasons. The first is all the images that you see on the screen are actually background images, and they're actually using kind of like a JavaScript behind the scenes to pull in and request that image after the page loads. So if you load this site up, it's super fast. Everything gets laid out, all the text gets kind of positioned, and then you'll see those images kind of filter in kind of behind the scenes. So from a, I guess, kind of overall page weight and performance aspect, they do that really well.
Not to keep focusing on image, but something that Kevin started bringing up a little bit, and we're not going to go into super detail again, but the concept of retina images. So that's just really creating images that, opposed to standard resolution, are actually twice the size, or 4 pixels for every 1 pixel on a standard screen. Both of the sites we're going to be looking at only use retina images. They're not doing any sort of device call or device detection to pull in whether or not they're serving up retina images or standard images. They're both just using retina images. So it's kind of interesting that that's the way that some sites are going. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so if the image, you get like a chuck on the internet and it doesn't load up the images automatically, does the gradient show through with the content load?
It does.
I just want to make sure that it's improved over moving the static text over top of that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and one weird design thing that they did that I'm kind of surprised that they made the decision. It is kind of weird at times, especially it's something that's a little bit more washed out like this. They're using like a magenta over purple. Doesn't read all that great. Probably the usability is really poor on that. So I'm sure that chafes Kevin's hide maybe. So, teach his own, I guess. A couple of other things that they're doing that's interesting, both for this site and Microsoft, is they're using custom web fonts. So now with HTML5, CSS3, we're able to pull in pretty much any font and utilize that within your design, but you always have a bit of a knock in that you have to allow the user, if they don't already have it on their computer, to download that font. So a project that we worked on internally here was an international website using, it was mostly for a Chinese audience. So we're using a Chinese font, which it turns out Chinese fonts are very large in size. This particular font was several megs. So trying to load that as a web font was a huge hit, so we had to find several workarounds to make that a little bit more of an efficient process. So yes, you can use custom web fonts and you can pull in tons of web fonts. It looks great, but you also have to keep into consideration that that is going to tax your device depending on whether you're hooked up to Wi-Fi, etc. So the next thing that's kind of interesting that Polygon did, and is always a huge consideration when you're dealing with a responsive site, is how do you treat your nav. So Polygon is decided to actually put their nav below that top gridded area, which I thought was a pretty bold and interesting move. Still works really well, and they do another really interesting thing that I haven't seen anywhere else, where if you click on an actual nav item on the desktop, oops, let me go back. On hover, you start displaying some additional content, which gets loaded on the fly.
Yeah, actually all the content in these navigation items here is kind of lazy loaded in, so you're not making an initial request for any images or any kind of additional content. It's only when you go to interact with any of those items do those additional pieces get pulled in via Ajax. So.
And it's really fast. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's a super small request, so there isn't a huge wait time for that stuff. So.
And then another really interesting thing they did, opposed to having some sort of tree navigation, they have a really nice way of using sub-navigation here. So they've broken up this initial pieces into reports, opinion, culture, and recent. So I just thought that was a really interesting way of approaching their main nav. Even though this is probably a very complex nav, it's broken up into a really simple way to easily navigate through each one of the different categories or topics. And then, as they're moving into more of the getting closer to a smaller resolution or a mobile resolution, they do their typical, what we sometimes call like the hamburger treatment. So it ends up looking a little bit more like, bun, burger, bun. And that's just kind of become like the icon for to indicate that that's where your nav is hiding. So once again, kind of typical use, they're doing a nice thing where it's sticky. So once you get to a certain spot, it's always going to pop back in. One of the reasons, like a lot of times, it'll just automatically stick. This you can notice once you stop scrolling is when it kind of goes back sticky or pops up in the top. And that's kind of a hack around how iOS...
Yeah, I think it was iOS 5 didn't support position fix correctly, so I guess their kind of way around that was to just kind of set the nav to be position absolute, and then as it kind of scrolls back into view, it'll just kind of pop back into the top of the window there.
A big design consideration that kind of fell through the cracks with these guys was that within, we're just using an iPhone simulator and we're just showing Safari. We were looking at this site on an iPhone in Chrome. I'm sure if you looked at different devices with different browsers, different things happen. But within Chrome, you start getting an actual bar that goes over the top. So it consistently covers the navigation. So it's just kind of a little bit of a miss in that you'd never be able to actually hit the nav without really trying to trick it. But once again, I mean, I'm sure these guys weren't looking at the time at iPhone with Chrome. Chrome might not have even been out, but those are some of the little gotchas that can happen when designing for responsive. Another small thing to note, so as you can see, they're using the hamburger, they're using the search icon, they're using a sign-in icon. They're not using icon fonts. Another responsive approach is to create what they call icon fonts, which you can take a series of icons, you can create your own font with it, and then start using it throughout your site. And what's beautiful about that is no matter what the resolution, it can scale without losing resolution or getting all chunky and pixelated. It treats it just like a typical font would. So say an @ symbol within a font, you can blow that to whatever font size you want. Same with these icons. They're vectors, so you can blow them up and shrink them as much as need be. And they should read pretty well depending on how you're doing the design. Yes, Kevin?
Yeah, and with like web fonts, it has support from IE 5.5 all the way to the modern browsers. So like SVG, of course, is going to be vector and high resolution, but when you're using a font almost in place of an image, it's working on every device that you have out there, and it has the same look and feel. The only thing that you lose is it has to be one solid color. But there are even hacks around that.
And you don't need to have some kind of font creation software for that. There's a bunch of online tools that allow you to create your own icon fonts on the fly and update them on the fly. The one that I used last was IcoMoon. So you can just Google that. It works pretty well. We haven't really had any issues with it, so it's pretty top-notch. Another small thing that we noticed as we're looking through this is that they're not using any sort of touch detection. So you can see that they do utilize carousels and whatnot throughout the site somewhere. I think it's here. If we change the resolution, this starts turning into a carousel. No, maybe it's not on here right now. They did have a carousel on their site yesterday, I swear to God. There it is. Yeah. What's that?
It's not their own page, the carousel.
Yeah, so they're not using touch detection for their carousel. It's not a huge miss by any means, but as Kevin was saying, if someone's kind of expecting that to happen within, say, a tablet, that's a little bit bizarre. Having to hit the arrows, or there's a little bit of a loss there, but once again, that's not wrong by any means. I was just a bit surprised that they weren't using touch detection at all. And when we start looking at the Microsoft site, that kind of happens again, and it's a little bit more of a strange way that they're utilizing their carousel. So I was kind of surprised that they weren't utilizing touch, especially since there's a lot more Windows machines or like Windows laptops that now are enabled with touch. And just one other small comment, as you're going from the wider resolution down to the mobile device, is they've just made certain design considerations. There's a lot of really nice small details within the desktop version that we thought was pretty cool, such as, it's really hard to see in this monitor, but they have this kind of cool little page flip that's semi-transparent that gets removed once you start hitting it on the smaller resolutions. They do this really cool fade out for when there's too much content. We thought that was an interesting way of doing the read more. And they have a kind of a clever way that they're doing that with development. You start losing that, as well as all this nice faceted corners and whatnot. So how that all ends up breaking down is they just become rectangles within the phone itself. You're not losing a whole lot, but you are missing some of those nice details that really make this Polygon site stand out and make it a little bit more interesting than, say, your typical Microsoft site, exactly. So it's just like those small nuances, that really made the site stand out for us, but you start losing a lot of it in the mobile. And as I was referring to earlier, a lot of these photos end up getting truncated or cropped in kind of bizarre ways once we get to mobile. For the most part, I think they do an amazing job of having whatever's key within the image always live in the center. But as you can see, sometimes it kind of falls off. We have this poor kid sitting in the corner now because we don't know what's here or over there. So, it's a huge site. They're doing a lot of updates all day long. For them to always have the perfect image to crop perfectly, it's not going to happen. Overall, they do an amazing job of being able to utilize those images just so. One last thing. Ads. So Polygon being, a commercial site, they have ads, and the ads aren't responsive. So as you're changing resolution, there are certain resolutions where the ads start breaking some of the content. So you get this weird ad for the new X-Men show. It's getting truncated. It's causing the grid to break. Other than that, the site reflows really well, but it's these ads that I'm sure weren't considered quite as much, or there was no solution for responsive ads at that point, which there still really aren't. So that is a pretty huge consideration to make as well. If you know that there's going to be zones that are going to have to be utilized for ads, you might want to try to consider a way of treating that. The only way we currently would recommend to treat that is just have several different ads for different resolutions, and that's going to be a lot of legwork. That's we're trying to get around with responsive as a whole, one code base, and this is difficult. Yeah, Mark?
So there's actually the electric show, just talk about
Oh, shit. Sorry.
And actually, I think Boston Globe was probably the first one to actually kind of do that responsive ad technique that you kind of talked about, where they basically like those different breakpoints still load in or show different ad spots depending on the size. Obviously, that's what Polygon thought of.
Or maybe they did. There's no solution. Yeah.
One thing I noticed on the Polygon site is they're actually using the data attribute and storing JSON in there for like 8 different slices of each image.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that's kind of like their home-rolled responsive image solution. They're not using
So
picture fill or something like that. It is actually really cool.
Yeah, so like their JSON like keys are like all the different viewport sizes basically.
Yeah.
And then they have a link for it. So it adds a lot of bloat to their site, but I've never seen that. That was pretty interesting. So.
Sure.
Cool. Before we move on to the Microsoft site, does anyone have any questions or comments, anything they noticed on this page that they wanted to kind of call out? If not now, we can wait until the end of the next one too. So as we're looking at the Xbox, the Microsoft version, same thing. If there's something you guys want to call out, just holler. Okay. All right, so Microsoft. It's kind of interesting that Microsoft has started embracing responsive. As we're trying to figure out what we're going to show today, we also thought it was interesting that Kevin kind of brought this up, whether or not Apple's site is responsive or not. After their keynote, was that last week? Their landing page became somewhat of a responsive experience. It's pretty bad. We looked at the code. It was even worse than what it looked like aesthetically. So Microsoft is, kind of at least embracing it and trying to do it right, and has, have some interesting choices in what they're embracing and what they're not utilizing. And as you actually start hitting up the page with some of their
So the
size
stats on this are
considerations.
a lot smaller, and obviously because it is a little bit more sparse than the Polygon site. But on a large screen, it's 1.5 megs, 71 requests, and 40 images, and then on a small screen, it's about half of that at 814K, 64 images or 64 requests and 33 images. So they're definitely doing some work kind of on the server side to either serve up different HTML or some different images to kind of reduce the size of that for that mobile consideration. So.
And I think one of the choices they probably made from the get-go is this is much more of a utility site. They want you just to find the information you need and click through into whatever your next experience is, where the last site, Polygon, is something that they really want you to spend time with and explore. So, they aren't going over the top to really dazzle you with their design, but they do some nice things that I thought was a pretty clever or some interesting considerations. A couple of the pieces that they're using is they are using sprites, which I thought was interesting, but it's just within the actual search icon. And another really bizarre thing is they are using icon fonts, but they're only using it on the footer. So this is the only place that they're using an icon.
That we found so far.
Yeah.
It might be tucked away somewhere.
I thought that it would have been real clever if they would have done it with all these, but that's not the case. Those are just, I think, PNGs.
They're all
So,
individual ones.
yeah,
too,
they're all
right?
individual.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know. I don't know why they made that decision and why they kind of started going in the world of icon fonts, but didn't, go for it. They're also using custom web font again. This is a font that they're also using quite a bit within their operating system. So that makes a lot of sense. It downloads pretty quick. There's a lot of weights. It reads well. And that's probably why they use it for their operating system, but also another consideration that they made. And then jumping and looking at their navigation, this is really interesting in that, once again, huge navigation, but where polygons seemed pretty elegant and kind of a cool experience, not quite so much here. Pretty daunting list, and that's on desktop. So once you start getting over onto the mobile, they did do one thing that's really cool, and Kevin pointed out today that now Facebook and Twitter have also made this update. They've moved where typically the nav icon's been on the left, they've moved it to the right. And I'm assuming this consideration is for right-handed people. So there's kind of two different types of users I've noticed. There's people who use their touch device or their phone with their thumb, and then there's people who hold it with one hand and then use their finger for like the pointer or the cursor. Either way that you use it, if you're right-handed, it's actually a lot easier to kind of hit that icon in that top right corner. So I'm assuming that being that most people are right-handed, that's why they made that consideration. But I thought it was interesting that Microsoft was ahead of, say, Facebook and Twitter on this.
Yeah, that left-right navigation, whether it's on desktop or on mobile phone, I don't think anyone has an answer on that, and I haven't seen a lot of data on that either. So if anyone has any insight on what performs better in their case, I'd really love to know.
I like it on the right.
What?
I like it on the right.
Yeah.
I like it on the right, too. I started using it, I was like, oh, that's pretty handy. It's real nice.
I don't know why Facebook decided to do it on the left. That kind of drove everything.
One of the cool things actually about the navigation, though, is even though it is very complex, they actually use the same code base to kind of do both the desktop and the mobile version, where I think Polygon actually has two separate versions that they kind of request in via Ajax. This is all just one set of code that they use and just kind of reskin. So.
Yeah. So as you see, once they get to mobile, they just start collapsing a lot of that nav into subcategories. So that's definitely one approach. But there's so many different approaches, and there's no definitive answer as to what the best way to utilize a huge nav, especially in mobile, is right now. Once again, Brad Frost is a great resource for looking at different navigation, what we call design patterns or web patterns. So just different ways of utilizing nav or thinking about nav or how we can treat nav within a smaller width device. There's the idea that the nav should always be at the bottom, so if you were to click that nav button, it would actually shoot you to the bottom of the page, and all your nav would be there. And your footer can also act as your nav, or we have the expanded versions. There's several different concepts and ideas around which one's better. Brad Frost does a good job of kind of showing all of them and talking to what the benefits and negatives of each are. So that's definitely worth checking out as well. Another kind of bizarre consideration or decision that they made was with their carousel. So within desktop, they're utilizing bullets to be the indicator, the way that you're switching from carousel item to carousel item. Within their mobile, they've gotten rid of that, and it's actually edge arrows. So you're using arrows left and right, so you have to touch left or right to scroll through if you want to. Otherwise, it's just auto-scrolling as well. So it's kind of, I feel like you should probably always keep your UI similar, and they decided not to. It's also kind of, as it's scrolling through, you'll notice that their arrows jump. It's also kind of a weird thing.
Those are really difficult to touch too.
Yeah.
I was playing with it. I frequently tap on the actual article or whatever. That's not my mistake.
Dark patterns.
There's this really awesome, I forget, I think it was actually Windows that put it out, about guidelines for touching and gestures. I'll have to post it on the meetup page, but it's really amazing in like the different sizes, and they give you design, like suggestions from every single event. And it was, I'm pretty sure it was Microsoft, which is very odd that that's such a poor experience.
Yeah. And but even though there are some kind of strange decisions that were made in that last page, this is their Windows page. It's linked off from the last, just Microsoft.com, and I believe this came a little bit later. So they definitely had some lessons learned and did some more interesting approaches on this page itself. They're creating this shape with CSS, which is pretty nice. So it's pretty scalable. But as you see, once we get down to a small resolution, down to what a mobile size is, that just goes to a typical color block. So kind of loses that interesting finesse that you get here, that nice motion and that kind of drawing your eye towards the image once you get down to mobile. So you're starting to lose things a little bit. And another interesting consideration that they made is, depending on what device you're looking at, they've kind of truncated or reduced some of the content. So where we have this nice photo and image of the new operating system with these hotspots where you can click and find out some of the features, they've taken that and created just an experience where you open up one of these little collapse nav pieces and you get that same information. So not quite as great of an experience, but they're still keeping all that same content. We had a weird little anomaly as we were going through this presentation earlier, where on my actual phone, some of the content disappeared, but on this emulator, there was some content. So they're doing something where they're suppressing some content for certain resolutions, but it's super inconsistent. So we're not sure what exactly they're doing there, but it's something kind of bizarre, and I'm not sure why they would, within pretty close to a mobile resolution, decide to give certain content to one group and not the other.
Yeah, I guess kind of like what it would likely be, though, is some type of device detection, checking for a device ID or user agent, and then kind of serving up different content. One example would be this nice video that plays automatically for you on the mobile or the desktop size. They kind of just strip that out, and you kind of get just a autoplay carousel with, I guess, kind of a few of the different views. And that makes a significant difference from the page weight size. I think the desktop version of this page was 11 megabytes, and the mobile one is it's 1.7 megabytes. So the 9 megabyte video definitely not required for the mobile experience. So they made a good decision stripping it out of there. So.
But you're also not losing a lot, so I feel like the content is pretty much the same. It is a lot more powerful seeing the motion, seeing it actually in action, but with a series of images, you are telling the same story, and when it really comes down to it, it's that telling of story that's really important in regards to design and what you're trying to convey. So, I mean, I think that was a pretty good consideration, a pretty good way of having a similar approach, but bringing it to mobile and saving yourself some of that time. Kevin?
Yeah, was that 11 megs on initial download or after you downloaded everything?
I think it was initial download. Be like half my data plan.
And just one last little thing we wanted to look at is just how they're treating footers. So what they do that's kind of interesting here is that their footer is so robust that they're actually collapsing a lot of that within the footer itself. So it almost becomes like a secondary nav. I mean, they are trying to take a large amount of content and retrofit it for a pretty small screen, pretty small resolution. So this isn't really a, I don't know what else you could have done. You'd have to do something where it's not quite so crazy. So that's just, once again, navigation is a huge consideration when going from desktop to mobile, but so is the footer. So you have to kind of really decide how you want to treat that as well.
Is that our clue to wrap it up?
Yes, I think
Turn
so.
it off the lights. Nice.
There's SEO implications with that too, all that information.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so you are losing a lot of that as well. So now that we've kind of gone through both sites, is there anything else that anyone noticed as we're going through that you wanted to call out, or just any questions in general for the way that either of these sites were approached?
Polygon sites and infinite scroll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The homepage will go forever.
Which has become kind of an interesting pattern that a lot of people are implementing now. It seems to be a lot more what is happening. It seems just to be a lot more feasible, being that bandwidth is starting to grow. Yeah.
So all this content we'll post in the meetup group. We actually started a discussion. So if you go to the meetup page and you go to discussions, you can bring up any questions or any conversations related to any of this. I'll post the links that were talked about and slides and presentation. Try to record this, so don't know if it worked or not. If it did, I'll post that too.
Another thing that we kind of wanted to field was if there's any specific topics within responsive that people are interested in that you might want us to focus for one of these meetups. And that's for designers or developers. This was a little bit design and a little bit development, but we would definitely go one way or the other for specific topics. So if there's anything people are really interested in, make sure. I mean, if you want to raise your hand and state something now, just start a discussion or just bring it up within the site.
Yeah, one topic is it was really good you mentioned each site for mobile and desktop and how they were different.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of explaining how it works. How do you do the device detection and how it works in the back end too, and observing which layer page on mobile versus desktop, all those different techniques.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, and I really briefly talked about it, but it was in that last slide of RxD. And that's one of those pieces that we I guess, throw in the bucket of RxD. It's just user detection and really not looking at the whole site, but looking at individual functionality. Maybe it changes based off of being mobile, your connectivity, or whatever it may be. So we'll probably cover on some of that, but if there's something specific I would really like to know, make sure we get on it.
Yeah, I told Brad Frost that you guys left him. It says hi and that
That was nice of him.
Awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, that just actually was kind of a coincidence that Kevin brought him up and then ended up coming up in ours as well.